Thank you so much, and good morning. Can you all hear me? Is the microphone okay? Great, thank you. So to read any version of the Arthurian legend is to enter a familiar world for many readers. We recognize signposts along the way: Arthur's humble origin, a sword, a brief shining moment before the traitor rises and the darkness falls. We know the beats of the story, and we know how it ends. So what do you do with a story whose ending is already known when you translate it into an interactive medium that depends on not having a fixed path through the story? Two Arthurian ChoiceScript games offer contrasting examples of how to answer this question, and I hope opportunities to say a few broader things about how to approach interactive literary adaptations. At King Arthur's Christmas Feast by Travis Moy embraces the constraints of the original canon. Pendragon Rising by Ian Thomas pushes against them. Each approach not only shapes the author's intended style of play, but also echoes the medieval texts on which they are based and the medieval experience of reading those texts. So before I get to the games, I'd like to say a few words about my background in interactive fiction and medieval studies to explain why I'm taking this approach. So currently, I am an editor, author, and publisher at Choice of Games, which has published almost 200 interactive novels in ChoiceScript, which is why I'm focusing on ChoiceScript games, because it is the platform I know best, and because there are a lot of Arthurian games out there, I needed to narrow it down somehow. Before that, I got my PhD in medieval history. There's me in my nice floppy hat, specializing in 12th century aristocratic culture in England and Normandy. And I was a professor for several years. Arthurian literature is a key source for understanding aristocratic culture at this time and place. Medieval authors inscribed upon the characters whatever traits they felt made a good knight or a good king, and they used familiar stories to explore contemporary political issues. Plus, as we'll see later, many Arthurian stories were considered part of actual history in the medieval period. So next, a few words about the ChoiceScript games in question. At King Arthur's Christmas Feast was written by Travis Moy and published independently in 2021 for IF Comp, the 27th annual interactive fiction competition. It's a retelling of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which is an anonymous 14th century poem. And in this game, you play Gawain. It's a pretty direct adaptation. It includes long quotations directly taken from the original text, translated into modern English. The original, as I said, was written in the 14th century, so it was in Middle English. I'm not going to summarize the whole plot because it would be very long, but it focuses, as the title suggests, on Gawain, one of King Arthur's knights, and his solo adventures through some very weird stuff. I will touch on individual plot points as they become relevant for this talk. And this is what the author said about his goal in writing the game. He wants to arouse interest in the original poem and its period. And he wants to evoke the feeling of being Gawain, experiencing those adventures in the original text. Pendragon Rising was written by Ian Thomas and published by Choice of Games in 2015. And full disclosure, I was the editor, so my comments here will reflect some of the guidance that I gave to the author at the time. And in this game, you play as King Arthur through the events of the beginning of the legend. Uther Pendragon's death, Arthur's rise from youthful obscurity, and ascent to leadership. And this is what this author said about the game. He's British, so when he wrote it, he used S's. He described it as an idealized, fictionalized version of what readers expect to find in an Arthurian story. So it's less about experiencing a particular piece of the Arthurian canon and more about putting the reader inside a story that feels Arthurian. And these two games' different relationships with their respective texts affect how each one approaches questions of choice and agency. So let's start with At King Arthur's Christmas Feast. So one of the central themes of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, the original poem, is that Gawain is caught in a chain of events that he doesn't fully understand and can't break out of. At every step in the story, he feels there is only one possible action he can take. He feels constrained by his prior obligations and by his values, his honor, his oaths of loyalty to his king, and his obligation to his host. So in keeping with its goal of evoking the feeling of being in the original text, at King Arthur's Christmas Feast constrains choices. The author's comment from inside the code itself give the player a sense of inevitability. So here's an example of a scene from the very beginning of the game. At the titular Christmas feast, Gawain is taking up the challenge from the Green Knight that sets off the chain of events of the rest of the story. King Arthur holds out the Green Knight's axe for Gawain to take, and here's the choice. You can take the axe eagerly, you can take the axe gingerly, but you can't not take it. Sometimes you can try to do something different, and occasionally it works. Here's a scene from later in the story. Gawain has been offered hospitality by Lord Bertilac, who, spoiler alert for 14th century text, is the Green Knight in disguise. The Lord is going out hunting and tells Gawain to stay home. And in the original poem, that's how it works. Gawain stays home and does other stuff. In the game, Gawain can ask to go with the Lord. Honestly, I'd rather join him in his hunt. But Bertilac refuses. So you have to do what happens in the original. Again, this is not to say you can never break away. You can, at other times in the story, exercise your agency. There are choices that let you do different things. For instance, you can take a side quest to go to a holy spring and get a blessing, and that helps you in a later fight, which is a thing that didn't happen at all in the original. And where in the original, Gawain breaks a promise to Bertilac at a key moment in the story, you can choose to keep that promise. But at the end of the game, when you return to Camelot and tell your brother everything that happened, there's no option to lie about what you did. There are two options in this choice, and one is always grayed out depending on what you did earlier in the game. So if you broke the promise, the only option you can select is tell the story of how you broke your promise. If you kept your promise, the only option you could select would be tell the story of how you kept it. So at King Arthur's Christmas Feast, not only replicates the relationships and events in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, it recreates the feeling of being Gawain in the original text by constraining the player's choice. If Gawain as a medieval knight is trapped by his oath to the king, then so is the reader. You as a 21st century person can want to refuse to take the axe when King Arthur orders you to take it, but Gawain as a medieval knight can't refuse. Now, turning to Pendragon Rising, we find a different and yet equally medieval approach to the text. So unlike at King Arthur's Christmas Feast, which was published independently, Pendragon Rising was published by Choice of Games, so it had to fit within our design principles. And one of our most important design principles is that the reader must be in control of the story. Now, the author's goal was also to cover the early part of Arthur's story, so it focuses a lot on Arthur choosing what kind of leader he's going to be, as you see here. Just, ruthless, diplomatic. Will he succeed at that? Or also you could be Arta, choosing what kind of leader she is going to be. Choice of Games also always lets you pick the gender of your character. But if you diverge too far from the story, then it won't be the same story and it won't feel Arthurian anymore. So how do we strike that balance? One way to do that is the same way that Travis Moy did in at King Arthur's Christmas Feast. You acknowledge the original story and present the option to do something else. In Pendragon Rising, these opportunities are much more frequent, and when you get a choice like this, you are almost always able to do something different if you want. And so here's an example. You're in Ambrosius's tomb, you're King Arthur, and there is a sword right there. You know what you're supposed to do. But as a player, you do have a choice not to take it. See, there's other things there. You can take the torque, there's the silver chalice, there's the sword, and there's the banner. So you can take the banner if you select that option. And if you take one of the other objects, it will give you other benefits. If you have the banner, it helps you rally the troops at a battle later in the story. So you know what Arthur is supposed to do, but you don't have to do that. Now, crucially, the scene also works if you don't know the canonical story. But if you do know the story, you have an even deeper understanding of what it means, and you know what it means for you to choose something different. Playing with this kind of canon divergence is a fairly common method in interactive works adapted from existing works of literature. And here are a couple examples. First, we have the classic Ryan North, To Be or Not to Be, which is his take on Hamlet. And he marks Shakespeare's choices to show you what really happened. That's the options with little skulls next to them are always what happened in the original. So if you want to follow the original plot of the play, you can do that. And if you always want to choose the option that is not in the original play, you can do that instead. A more recent one that is still ongoing is Forever Beth, which is an interactive reading of Little Women, adapted by Liz Anderson, who I know is here at NarraScope this weekend. It starts out as a direct retelling of Little Women. You get in your email newsletter a page from the book every week, except at the end of every chapter, readers vote on one character to die. And anybody can die except Beth. Beth lives. Thank you very much. But everyone else is fair game. And based on that, the story is getting increasingly different and increasingly weird as it goes on. Because, of course, you can't just kill off major characters and have no effect on the story. Those characters are still doing things for the rest of the book. So right now, Meg has been killed off and she's been replaced with Skeletor. It's weird, it's great, go check it out. But in all of these cases, this is the point. The fun comes from knowing that you are diverging from the canon and seeing what happens next when the story turns into something unexpected. Back to Pendragon Rising, where this divergence from canon can also come as a result of indirect choice. Building off of, if you kill off one character, it's going to have ripple effects later in the story. So all of the individual choices that you can make along the way have ripple effects, and those ripples combine to produce many potential outcomes. So here's 4 different versions of the same scene near the end of the game. And the speech that Kay gives you is subtly different depending on what you've chosen earlier in the game and how well you succeeded at advancing your goals. So at the end of the game, you can be war leader or not. You can be on your way to becoming High King or Queen or not. Or you can end with no titles at all. Or you could even die in battle. That's an option. So by allowing players to break out of the constraint of canon, authors can create stories that don't match the original. And the fun comes from the consciousness of that mismatch. Now I'd like to circle back to the idea of embracing constraint, but in a different way. Pendragon Rising, even more than at King Arthur's Christmas Feast, takes the player's awareness and brings it into the character. As I mentioned before, Ian Thomas wanted to play very intentionally with what the player expected to see in an Arthurian story. And this intention brings Pendragon Rising closer to the medieval experience of reading these stories. Now, King Arthur was a historical figure. He actually existed. And he was included in historical texts written in Wales in the early medieval period. But he entered the mainstream European intellectual conversation in the middle of the 12th century with Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain. I'll talk a little more about that later. It was written in Latin in Wales around 1135 to 1140. And as the title suggests, this book positioned itself as history. After that point, there was a stream of Arthurian literature throughout the Middle Ages that presented itself as legitimate history, in contrast to the parallel literary tradition that produced Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. That never claimed to be history, nor did anyone ever treat it as history. So to show you how much weight this intellectual trend carried, here is a bit from a later text, the Genealogical Chronicle of the Kings of England, written around 1466. And King Arthur is listed as a historical figure, treated as one of the present king's ancestors. So he is part of history. He's a real person. And members of the intellectual community who knew that history would expect, when they read an Arthurian text, to see certain events occurring in a certain order. It's history. It actually happened. Of course, those events had to be there. So most of the 12th and 13th century Arthurian histories written in Britain kept the same story beats. The reader's satisfaction came from finding what should be there. So how do we bring that same knowledge to the character? Through prophecy. Remember that scene we saw earlier where you can go to the tomb and take one of the 4 items? This comes just before that scene. The player goes to that tomb because they receive a prophecy that they must go there. The White Lady tells them they must go to the Isle of the Dead. Choice is constrained and the plot is directed by the knowledge that you must fulfill this prophecy. And this idea of prophecy, and especially of past as prophecy, is another very medieval element of the Arthurian canon. So back to Geoffrey of Monmouth, History of the Kings of Britain in the mid-12th century. He's the originator of this prominence of prophecy in Arthurian texts. In the middle of this book, he has Merlin give a long prophecy that essentially covers the events of the rest of the book. So the characters who hear it know what's going to happen next, and the readers do too. And later adaptations of this text expanded the prophecy even more, adding on to Merlin's prophecy to include events that happened right up to the time that the adaptations themselves were being written. So another way of legitimizing this historical text, the reader could see this and say, look, Merlin was right. He predicted this thing that happened just 10 years ago. So this was legitimizing these texts by including things that the reader expected to see. Probably getting short on time, so I'll just see this one very briefly. Later authors also played on this. This is an excerpt from Lauman, who is writing the early 1200s in Middle English. And he gives Arthur a vision. Like, Arthur has this dream where Arthur himself foresees Mordred betraying him, and Mordred and Guinevere are literally pulling down the great hall around him. The reader already knows how the story ends, and now so does Arthur. So, by introducing an interactive element into our reading of the Arthurian legend, we join the medieval tradition of participation in those stories. We can push against the constraints of canon and have fun seeing the results of our choices as they add up to create a story that is uniquely our own. Or we can follow the path that we know other stories have walked and have fun seeing how we reach those inevitable destinations. Or we can have fun as an actor does in playing out the script that has been written for us. Or have fun as a medieval reader might have, in the satisfaction of seeing prophecies fulfilled, and in the knowledge that whatever Arthur we choose, they are still Arthur. Thank you. And we have time for questions. Discord folks, if you don't have time to get in your question during this, I will be online later and we'll get to your questions then. So, any questions? Yes.
I'm curious about something very specific, which is that some Arthurian legends are unfinished. Like, I'm thinking of Percival and the Story of the Grail, for instance.
Yes.
Have you encountered any games that kind of engage with that unfinishedness, either using the format to fill in the gaps or engage with it?
Ooh. That is a great question. I'll repeat it. So some Arthurian tales are unfinished, specifically it's Cartan's version of Percival. And are there any games that engage with that? And not to my knowledge, but now I really want to write one. That is that's a great idea. Yes?
I was really struck by your mention in Canterbury Rising about the past of the character. I guess I'm curious about how is that. Does that end up shaping the story either like an explicit or like implicit ways? And did you find that like was a presence, or was that just like as simple as like a charm?
So the question was about the gender flip, and how did that affect the story? And the biggest effect it had on the story was on the player side. The story was very nearly the same, with one important exception later, that I'll get to in a minute. So whatever gender the player chose for Arthur or Arta, everything happened exactly the same. Some other characters' genders changed based on that, but story played out exactly the same. Players perceived the characters differently depending on what pronouns were used. So yes, one thing that we worked hard to grapple with was the relationship with Morgan and the conception of Mordred, which was included in this part of the story because, of course, one area where we were not at all willing to give up player agency was in sexual consent. Like, if you don't want to sleep with another character, you don't sleep with that character. And so but Mordred has to exist somehow. So we had, I forget, I think if the player does, the player's Arthur or Arta doesn't sleep with Morgan, then I think Morgan sleeps with Bedouir and conceives with Bedouir instead. But yeah, that is the only thing. And, depending on the various gender combinations, either Morgan is the one who gives birth to Mordred, or Arta can give birth to Mordred. Yeah, and unfortunately, the author was never able to write a sequel, and I'm really sad because I wanted to see how that all played out. Other questions? Do we have time for more questions?
Yeah, we can do that. More questions.
Okay, great. 2 more. 4. Okay, 1, 2.
You mentioned Travis's game was published independently and doesn't conform to the standards of choice games. Is there a place for Travis's game to be published by ChoiceScript or not? Or
Sorry, can you repeat that? There was some other noise.
Can you imagine a scenario where Travis's game could be published by Choice of Games, or would it have to have been changed too much?
Yeah, it would have really had to have been different. He was doing something very, very intentional. I mean, and that is one of the trade-offs of our choices have trade-offs, and that's one of the trade-offs of our decision to have this very specific approach to choice and player agency, is that not all stories will fit inside that model, but for the stories that do fit inside that model, that's what we do. And yes.
So you're a medieval studies scholar.
Yes.
Worked on this. Is there a concept or an author or a piece of medieval study of medieval history that isn't present in any of these games that you think should be, or that you would like to see?
Oh, that is such a great question. The question was, is there a medieval work that isn't present in any of these games that I wish was present? And yeah, I think going back to what you were saying before, the French Arthurian tradition, I think would be a really rich environment for this kind of game. The French Arthurian tradition is where you got a lot of the knights going out on quests, whereas the English tradition was more historically based and more, following Arthur and events at his court. So the French tradition is where you get the origins of a lot of the really weird stuff with, the knights in different colored armor at the crossroads and magic springs and lions and stuff. So that, I think, is a really, there's some really great opportunities for some fun games there. And I think that is it. So thank you very much. If you have other questions, drop them in the Discord. I'll answer later. Thank you.